Welcome, everybody. We are so glad that you've decided to join us this evening. We are live from Encounter Church in Kentwood, and my name is Dirk Van Eyck. I'm the lead pastor here at Encounter Church, and we're continuing our series this evening. We're calling it A Conversation on Race, and what we started off doing last time is a conversation with myself and Pastor Reggie Smith. Pastor Reggie, would you mind giving yourself a little introduction this evening?
I am Reggie Smith, and I am the Director of Diversity for the Christian Reformed Church in North America.
Thank you very much. So we started off this conversation last time really by talking very broadly around the topics of race and the church, and we highlighted some of the maybe conversation gaps, and you offered several encouragements to us as a church body, and I know a lot of those have taken place. You said, find someone to have one courageous moment and have one conversation with somebody. And I know I did that. I know a lot of other people in our community did that. So first, I want to tell you thank you for last time and for showing up again tonight. If you've been joining us online and for our weekend worship experiences on Sunday, you know that we've been promoting this for some time now. A conversation on the movie Just Mercy. So it's a critically acclaimed movie. It's done very well. It was made public recently, and basically for the month of June, I think it was the entire month of June, you could just watch it free and stream it everywhere. And so we told, to catch you up a little bit on our community, we asked our whole community, watch the movie and think of some reactions or some responses. And so, church, we asked you all to write down your reflections, to email them into the church office, put them in the comment section below. We want to know what you're thinking. We want to know some of the questions. And I love your transparency as you just are like fully available to answer whatever questions we might have. And you did that last time, and I know you come with that same heart this time as well. So if we've got some questions, I can't wait to hear them, and I'll ask them to you as they come in and as we have time. So the movie Just Mercy, and just very broadly, the title. What does the movie's title, Just Mercy, mean to you?
The title means to me it's about how do we show compassion when we live in a context of fear and anger. And what Stevenson is trying to communicate to us is that we show mercy to the people who seem to be the throwaway people, the marginalized, the people who don't get the ink. So if you're thinking about people who are incarcerated or in prison, those are the ones who we should be showing mercy to. And as Christians, we know that when we do that, we are showing the face of Jesus. And so when we show mercy to others, it's really kind of a sermon back to us, how much we need mercy.
There's your preacher heart coming out. I love that. I was thinking about that title, or the definition sometimes of grace is unmerited favor. Mercy is avoiding a punishment that might come on us. And the punishment, right, for our sin is on all of us, right? And so all of us are deserving this death sentence for our sin, and God spares us from that. And so trying to see ourselves into the story as well. Before we move on to more of the movie, I am reminded in this moment that we're in part 2 of this series, and there's already scheduled a part 3. And so I'm very excited to announce and to share that on July 22 at 5 o'clock, right back here, Facebook Live and YouTube, we're going to have a guest with us. And I just want to read a little bit of her bio for us tonight, because we're going to be talking about education. And as we've been opening this up very, very broadly with a conversation on race in the church, and now we're talking more criminal justice tonight and some of the implications there, there's systematic discrepancies, differences all over the place. And so July 22 at 5 o'clock, we are going to welcome Crystal J. Sanders to the stage to talk about her experiences and expertise about race and education. Crystal has an MA in education and an MFA, is currently finishing her PhD in education at the University of Michigan. She's a published poet, a teacher, activist, and public speaker whose work explores dialect, literacy, and educational inequality. So I'm very excited that Crystal J. Sanders is going to be joining us. I apologize for interrupting the flow of the conversation, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that this is a conversation that's going on. It's not just one time, but we want to make sure that our attention stays on it for as long as we can. So coming back to Just Mercy, there's all of these themes in the movie, harking back to the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. And at some points in the movie, I was thinking like, this is really heavy. Like they keep alluding to it again and again and again. And as I dug into some of the origins of the movie, I found out that was actually Bryan Stevenson's lived experiences. He said, everywhere I went in Monroeville, people would say, you got to go to here, you got to check out the museum, you got to go to the playground that's named after. When you hear the To Kill a Mockingbird, all the images, I guess, what do you think of, how does that hit you, the images and the story?
It kind of hits me because as people were talking about that in the movie, I wondered, it was interesting to me that the white people were talking about it, not so much the black people.
Yes.
And so you get these two different versions of how you see that. For the white people who talked about Harper's Lee, there's a sense of pride that they knew her and grew up with her. And so there's this kind of applying their reputation to be around her. But it was interesting to me that I didn't hear that from the black people.
Yep.
And so it just really magnified. There's two different Monroeville.
Yeah.
There's the white Monroeville, and then there's the black Monroeville. And for what it was for Walter, it was different for Chambers. And so it just really magnified those two worlds, which was very, very common and still is in the South.
I'll admit, man, I didn't even pick up on that. I heard it so many times, I never even realized that not a single non-white person in the movie mentioned it, but again and again and again. Kind of going directly at it, though, the plot of To Kill a Mockingbird is, of course, Atticus Finch is a white lawyer defending an innocent black man, and they celebrate him. I mean, in Monroeville today, not of course in To Kill a Mockingbird, but in today, Atticus Finch is our hero, the Harper Lee, growing up here. And even though Lee herself uses the town's racism and prejudice as the backdrop for her novel, calling some things, so not exactly in the best light, but they're proud that they got included. And that's it's a proud, heroic story that was founded there. Just Mercy, though, true story, a black lawyer defending a black innocent man. Not exactly the same reputation, or not exactly the same reception, right? Do you think it has to do with him being black? If Bryan Stevens was white, do you think they would have seen him more like Atticus Finch?
I'm not quite sure. I think there in the movie they talked about there's one scene where Bryan Stevens goes to the house and he said other lawyers had been trying to help out Walter, and they all took their money. And so I don't know if they were white or if they were black, but I'm sure there were probably a couple. And so there's this sense of that they were being predatory. And of course, Atticus Finch is probably one of the top. In fact, I think the American Film Institute said he was the top person in terms of a hero of all the films, which was it came out in 1962. And it really, I really paid attention to Eva, Brie Larson's character, which I thought was kind of the opposite of what Atticus Finch is. And she plays more of a supportive role and really kind of highlights in a subtle way the white hero. And I just thought that was very clever in how he contrasts with the probably with the insight that this story is looming really large.
Yeah.
And here you have this assistant to Brian Stevenson who plays this more restrained, subtle role, a supportive role, but a very important role,
Mm-hmm.
which I found her performance was just very, very good.
So coming along with that theme of some of where the I would say courageous, in your words last time, the courageous acts come from, of course, Brian Stevenson. I mean, the protagonist in the film and in real life, the founder of the initiative. There was a scene, and my wife caught it, and she pointed it out to me when we were watching it together. At the end, as a spoiler alert, I mean, we asked everybody to watch the movie already, but at the end, when Stevenson is asking for essentially the case after the appeals to be thrown out, and the prosecutor, I have my notes here, otherwise I keep forgetting what some of their names are. The prosecutors, Tommy Chapman, is asked if he goes along with the motion or not. And he kind of eventually gives in and says, yes, I support that. And then, it's celebratory action. Do you feel like that in the movie kind of lent like the white credibility to the black lawyer's, case? Do you think like it was kind of a white nod to say like he needed that? I mean, was that uncomfortable for you?
No, not at all. I found it that I'm looking at the movie from start to finish, and what the movie does is that it depicts this long history of how criminal justice was done in the South. And criminal justice was done in the South, and if you think about that in terms of the Civil War, the Civil War didn't just stop really racist laws and policy, but specifically in terms of that there's this little a line in the 13th Amendment that says if a man does not have a job, you can arrest him. Well, all these freed black slaves don't have jobs. They're basically thrown out.
Right.
And states like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia arrested them and put them to work. So we see the very beginning of mass incarceration starts not so much in 1986 when this movie starts. It starts way back in 1865, and even before that there were laws. I mean, I'm thinking about one law that was, in fact, it was Alabama. In antebellum Alabama, there were 73 laws for blacks if they broke them in terms of offending whites. There was only one law if a white person offended a black. Right. And for those 73, black people could be lynched. And so we see this long discrepancy, this long arc of history that is happening in the criminal justice system. And it didn't just start right there, but it's been a long history, and very often we miss that. And Brian Stevenson does a very good job of kind of lifting that, because it's not just the cops, it's the prosecutor, it's the judge, yep, it's the jury. All of these factors play a key in if a black person really gets equal justice.
Yeah, I did not know that. They, again, picking up the theme of getting different educations, right? Mm-hmm. That still learning, still growing, still trying to figure all this out. Mm-hmm. We're both pastors, mm-hmm, and we often look at things like movies, and we start to see kind of biblical narratives come out. Right. I was picking up on the theme, the Luke chapter 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus, of course, tells the story when somebody got beat up and needed help. Yep. And who passes by? Priest, Levite, and as the Samaritan, the loathed, outcast Samaritan, and who's my neighbor, who helped? Well, I guess it was the one who showed mercy, which in light of the name of the movie is is pretty dramatic. Do you think that's a fair kind of analogy to draw on to say Bryan Stephens because of his nature of being, I don't know, Harvard, that puts him as an outcast in Alabama, a northerner, also, his race, ethnic background. Do you think that's a fair biblical analogy to draw?
Yeah, I think it is. Because everything is on the premise that story is about this lawyer, right? this young religious lawyer who's pretty hotshot, and he's talking to Jesus, and now Jesus shows up on the scene, and he thinks he can go toe to toe with him, and that he knows that law inside and out just as much as any other rabbi. And I find it interesting that Jesus doesn't give him a definition; he gives him a person, and that emulates exactly what Bryan Stevenson always tries to talk about: is you can't know people unless you are in proximity to them.
Yeah.
And that story illustrates that the priest and the Levite did not want to be approximate to the man who found himself almost half dead, but only the Samaritan got approximate with. You cannot show mercy to people unless you get close to them.
I feel like we need to let that hang for just a minute. There's a lot there, right? Because then what you're saying is we don't really have a shot at reconciliation here unless we get into proximity with each other. Leads into a question that was put in the comment section. That was so good. You mentioned earlier, there's two Monroevilles. There's a black Monroeville and there's a white Monroeville. Grand Rapids well. Would you say there's a black Grand Rapids and a white Grand Rapids?
Absolutely. Always has been. When black people came here in the 30s and 40s, there were only two places that they could live. One was on the southwest side, and one was on the west side of Division Street. Before there was 131, Division Street was our 131. And there were many well-meaning Christian reform people who practiced restrictive covenants. And what restrictive covenants were is that you could not sell your house to a black or a Jew. And those were enforced by the social network and the social bonds of white people at that time. And that really didn't break until about the late 50s when, as urban renewal was happening, those were called illegal and were done away with. But it didn't change hearts and minds, because what happened was white flight.
Right.
And again, bringing back what Stevenson says, is that we spend an awful lot of time moving away from proximity from black people, as opposed to moving towards one another. And if you think about Grand Rapids, even the neighborhood that I live in right now, was redlined in the early 1960s.
Can you tell us a little bit more? Redlining, that's a phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Redlining was a practice that was done by the federal government. And the federal government says that if a neighborhood is redlined, it means that they encourage banks to not provide loans for homeowners or people in that section or in that neighborhood. And that became kind of a way in which the wealth gap between whites and black grew exponentially. Yep. Because if you can't acquire wealth, and the only way that you acquire wealth is by buying a house. And because also when the government would not back those kind of loans, it allowed for sharks or predatory lenders to say, we'll give you a loan, but for 3 times or 4 times the interest rate, which made it very difficult. So it continued that black people would have to rent. Yeah. And so it just stretched in terms of that where your zip code is determines your life chances.
One of my earliest, realizations that just how clear some of the discriminatory practices were and how they played out. I was at an anti-racism training seminar, possibly put on by your office, full disclosure. And a gentleman in the group said he was in the Toronto area and he bought a house in like I want to say it was 1960s or something like that. And he said he was a graduate student. He had almost no money whatsoever. But the banker was a family friend. And he kind of knew, I think you're good for it. He didn't know, but he was actually competing with a woman, a person of color, and she didn't know the banker or any banker in the area. He says objectively, what he found out later, she was better qualified. She had sorry to graduate students watching this right now, she had a higher paying, more secure job. On paper, she was more qualified. She didn't know the banker system. And he said, I've lived in that house for 40 years. And the Toronto real estate housing market appreciated in that time. And he said it appreciated to the tune of $750,000. And I think about that woman who didn't get that house and presumably any house. If I could beat her in a bidding war on a graduate student's income, right, how could she ever achieve that? I don't say Canadian dream, but American dream. Mm-hmm. You know, what would you say to somebody who, well, I mean, feels guilty about like, I was a part of that system?
Well, social networks are built on trust. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of our white brothers and sisters, are you going to call yourself out on something that you know that you're taking advantage of,
right,
or that you're getting an advantage of? And that becomes kind of the unspoken secret in which we are a part of large social networks, which explains also why those two worlds exist, one black, one white. And because one favors another in all kinds of life chances, and to think about what opportunity is. And so I think that the movie really emphasizes again that what is actually fair isn't so much fair. And when you think about that, 1 in 3 black children born in Grand Rapids right now, one is going to go to jail. In fact, that becomes the formula for how states and counties determine if they're going to build another prison. There's a whole system that benefits from this system of mass incarceration. And so if you're talking about how do we change something if we're not willing to say, first, how do we benefit from it? Mm-hmm. Acknowledge that, and then begin to dismantle and take a hard look at, well, why does that happen? Why do black people not get loans? Yep. Why do black people not have the same opportunity to move to Byron Center or Forest Hills? And so we have to really recognize safely that race is a predictor of what happens to your life.
In the beginning of the film, there's the scene where Walter he owns his business. He cuts down the trees. Yep. He's driving along and he sees a roadblock of officers. He instinctively puts his hands kind of on the dashboard and where he shows them very, very publicly. Yep. Why does he do that?
He does that because he wants to let those officers know he's safe. Because there's a long history in which, and we see that being acted out even today, that many years ago I had to talk from my parents to say, here's what you need to do in order to not get killed by the police. And so it was things like keep your hands up.
You received that talk, like you called it the talk.
Oh yeah. All 4 of my brothers.
How old were you when that happened?
10 years old.
Early on.
Mm-hmm. Because I lived in Chicago, and Chicago was known as the most segregated city in America at that time. and there was not a really cozy relationship between the black community and Chicago police.
Yep.
And because of that history, we there was a real sense that if we didn't know those kinds of tactics, we would not come home that day. We could very easily be killed by the police. Nobody's going to come looking for us. You're just one casualty that ends up probably not even a blip in the Tribune or the Sun-Times or the Daily News. And that has been the long history that the black community has had with law enforcement, both the North and the South.
I didn't have the talk. I didn't really think much about sharing that talk with my kids. How do I address that? How do I write that? Is that just where we are right now, that some people have to have that conversation with kids and some people don't?
Yes. And the reason why is, and saying it in terms of your that there needs to be recognition that I think the film also kind of says to us again, there are two worlds in Monroeville. And there's the white world in which very often you would never have to run into a black person if you didn't want to. I mean, you could even do that in Grand Rapids. You could spend your whole life in a suburb of Grand Rapids and never have to have one relationship with a person of color. You can do that anywhere outside of here. And that becomes really a bubble in which I always kind of ask people, especially white people, I said, so tell me, how many black friends do you have?
Yeah.
And most don't have any because of those social networks in which it's really tough to step outside of them and to enter into a relationship that makes you feel different.
So I want to pick that up because I want to, one of our questions, and I think it's a good question to crowdsource as well. I'm going to ask you to answer it, but I'd like everybody watching online, how do we at Encounter get more proximity with our neighbors? And I'm thinking particularly of races outside of your own. I know as my wife and I have thought about buying a home, that was something that we thought about. We live very, very ethnocentric, worlds, right? Our kids go to school that's outside of a couple of adopted kids, is very, very white, and church as well. And so we thought we got to have one sphere, one world that we live in. So we live in I think it's a great little slice of Kentwood. That's just me. That is pretty diverse. But I'm asking everybody now watching in, how do you do it? Where do you bump into people? How do you increase that proximity? What's some of your advice on how to do that?
I think you got to first of all, you got to recognize that you're in that kind of bubble, that you are in that kind of network. And then ask yourself this question: what would it mean for me to step into a different world, a different context, and to not feel competent, to feel awkward, to not know the social cues, and to experience that firsthand? And I say you got to first make some mistakes. I am sure that every person here, if they were to evaluate their friendships right now and ask us, is my life richer or poorer by not having diverse friendships in my life? And if you have children, are my children better or poor by not having diverse friendships in their own lives in a world that is now growing exponentially browner and blacker every day? And then make some decisions of moving into those other worlds and begin to experience what does it mean to be white as a minority?
So that's a good one. That picking up, I love that. From our conversation last time and about some of the anxiety I shared just leading off the bat, talking about race is very, very uncomfortable for me. And you're just smiling and like, it is, Dirk. Yep. I can sense that too. It is. So it's not something that I've ever been trained to do. And we talked like that's kind of the premise of some of the literature around like white fragility and things like that. It's not, I didn't have a talk. It wasn't modeled for me, right? I don't know how to do that. And so you're kind of posing in very kind way. It's appreciated, but that I'm essentially at a deficit for not having those relationships around. And I look at things like picking out a school and I like, what's the grade point average or whatnot of the school, or the resources that, my kid, they have like a soccer team or robotics club, I look at those things. But we don't typically look at we don't have like a qualifier of like, oh, and your kid could also have a critical education in how to talk about race more.
One of the things that diverse friendships and relationships does for us is that it helps us to deal with conflict, and that we are all driven to similarity. We all are driven to like-minded people, whether that's at a church or online or at home or in our workplace. What we're finding is that in order to be a more emotionally intelligent person, you have to be able to deal with all kinds of people who comes with all kinds of background, who come with all kinds of perspectives. It actually makes you much more emotional resilient.
Yeah.
In order to, when you begin to have those kind of relationships and you don't become antagonized by it, you don't become frustrated with it. This is part of life. This is part of how we deal with a pluralistic, multiracial, multicultural life that's right in our midst, and it prevents us from developing further bubbles, which is easy to do, but from a church standpoint, it actually makes the gospel weaker, because what we're saying is that the gospel is not able to penetrate similarity. Then we might as well throw out the entire book of Acts, because that's entirely what it talks about.
In Galatians, Ephesians,
and Revelation.
Several chapters in Revelation. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Steven says Brian's mom was scared when he told her that he's leaving the Northeast and he's going down to Monroeville, Alabama. She saw it as a dangerous place. Are there places that make you nervous, anxious to go? I mean, you could think about this geographically, like cities, but I'm thinking maybe different settings or social settings to go into, or low places in Grand Rapids.
I think when I first moved to Grand Rapids, I was really scared to go into predominantly white spaces. When I was a student at Calvin Seminary, I was given opportunities to preach at different places around the area. Everything from Wayland to rural Kalamazoo to Cascade Township, and I didn't know anything about these particular spaces, but it kind of triggered for me going back to Chicago that to go into white spaces, I was fearful because I had no idea what to expect if I crossed a particular street or alley or a viaduct or expressway, because that was always kind of the sociological and psychological barrier between blacks and whites. And I didn't want to upset or to be a target in order that I could be hurt or even killed. And so even in Grand Rapids, there are just certain places that I would not go, especially if it's southwest of town. I was afraid. And when I would preach, I was out of there because people wanted to talk. Like, no, I don't want to talk. I just want to get back to the city because
Yeah.
I was afraid.
And I hate to say it, but the reaction may have been in that time, because I know how people treat seminarians, as, wow, that Reggie Smith guy, kid, maybe at that point, it was a little while ago. That Reggie Smith, he's not very personable. He didn't really stick around, right? And you've got like levels on how you're analyzing the situation and like what's going on, and then it just gets
right. I mean, and you think about what that mother was kind of thinking about when she's talking to Brian, and he would have to do the exact same thing going into Alabama, going into Georgia. He has to think about all the ways in which he could be killed by whites by simply living life. And she is aware of that because that same thing was probably happening in Delaware, which was at one time a slave state. And that becomes an exhausting and traumatic experience that you have to prepare yourself to go outside, to interact with people, and pray that you don't make the wrong mistake, do the wrong move, that you could end up losing your life.
And he has to be a lawyer, he's got a day job. So I want to come back to the talk that you were mentioning earlier, because we had a very interesting comment about it, looking for some specific encouragement from you. So it's a mom who shared the tension of needing to have this conversation with her black son, but also not wanting to promote fear. What kind of encouragement would you give either to a mom or to her son?
I would tell her that it's really not about fear. It is no different than how we prepare our kids for school, in that this is part of his education as a young black man who is going to be entering into a world in which she is trying to prepare him to not be the next George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, and that he will have the skills and the social whereabouts in order to do what is necessary for him to continue to live his life, not in fear, but actually to be more skilled in terms of living.
There's a scene in the movie where the prosecutor is being interviewed on 60 Minutes, which, after reading a little bit more about like the true story, that all actually happens. That was, I didn't know, a turning point in the case, kind of the turning of public opinion and opening up some avenues. But the scene is interviewing the prosecutor, is very dismissal of the entire thing. And what I didn't know in the movie as well, that he was far more dismissal in real life than even that what they casted his character as in the film. He did come around and join Stevenson's defense, but for a long, he was talking to the paper a lot. He was just but I digress. The 60-minute conversation, they're asking him, he's dismissal. He's in a bar. Behind him, there's a Confederate flag. That's in the news all over the place. Mississippi just voted to remove that emblem as part of their state flag. There's conversation around monuments, Confederate monuments being taken down. What do you see? What do you feel when you are confronted with those images, that emblem, those statues, whatever it is?
My parents grew up with that, living in Mississippi. And what it symbolizes is that flag represents slavery. It represents that the Confederacy was promoting a narrative that said Black people are never, ever human. Black people will never, ever be white. This is what God has ordained. This is also how we choose to live our lives. And this is the narrative that was given when the Confederacy lost the Civil War, there was a book that came out called the Lost Cause. This Lost Cause book was written by a former Klansman, and this book was a bestseller in the South, and became a bestseller because it gave a more positive understanding of how the South didn't really lose, but they actually won. And it permeated all of the Confederate. And what happened is that it changed that the South really didn't lose. The South was actually trying to preserve its way of life. And we all know that when we get a story that makes us feel good and it takes hold of our lives, something amazing happened. You'll fight for it because now it has an emotional tie to you. And so what the flag represented is this narrative, this history that the South needed to tell itself. We matter. We won. There's the old saying that the North won the war, but the South won the story. And that story was permeated through, if you think about the NASCAR, when the black racer, the black driver of getting rid of the Confederate flag. That flag is symbolic of history, whether that's Confederate monuments. It is about how do you tell history, not as it actually happened, but what you would like it to be. And what the South did is that they put it on the same pedestal as when the North tells their story of victory, the South tells their story, here's how we saw it. And that becomes the conflict in which Black people found themselves in, and why a lot of them left the South, because that became prominent, because most of those monuments came in the 20th century. They didn't come right after the Civil War. But, whether that's Robert E. Lee, it became a way of telling Black people, we still run this. And don't you ever forget it.
So what does it mean to you when you see the headline, Mississippi governor orders the emblem off the flag?
I think it's one more sign that Jesus got to be coming back soon. Yeah. And is that a sound? Is that a sign? I'm not sure.
It's in the back somewhere.
But if you think about, Mississippi was one of the hardest states. I think maybe South Carolina is probably the only other one in which, when they succeeded from the Union, that they said it is about slavery, not about states' rights. It's about preserving our way of life. And whether that's through James Meredith, when he tried to apply for admissions into the University of Mississippi in 1962, that was an amazing thing to see. And I think it's history because of the time in which we in, that kind of thing happened. I consider that one of the most marvelous things that's happened in 2020.
Let's talk about some of the role of policing in the movie Just Mercy. They are not cast in a very positive light. It was a historical fact that the prosecutor did order the arrest of one of the part of the defense as an intimidation tactic. And when Brian Stevenson, the lawyer, he did get those charges dropped, but that was all part of the strategy. They were harassed. Stevenson said in his book that he was threatened several times with a gun to his head, threatened to his life by police officers. There's a defund police movement that's happening in America today. We have a lot of tension around this. At the same time, the reaction is often around there are some bad apples, but we don't want to throw out the batch. What do we do? What do you see as a path forward? How do you experience some of those tensions in the different worlds that you live in? I know that you go to churches that are frequently predominantly white, and I'm wondering how you interpret or how you see some of these events.
I can understand how young people are feeling about defunding the police. And
we should maybe clarify the definition on some of that.
Yeah.
It isn't to have no more police, but allocate some of the resources to some other areas like counseling services and housing services and education, etc.
Right.
But sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to, but yes, go ahead.
It's part of a larger problem that's going on in a lot of police departments. I mean, my brother is a Chicago cop.
Okay.
And what we're finding is that there were major things that were happening in law enforcement. And again, it goes back to proximity. Like in Grand Rapids right now, policemen can live wherever they want. And that's by law. But I think something gets lost. When you don't know who your cop is, when you don't have a relationship with him, when you don't have, I see Officer Betty, and what happens is that it builds a sense of suspicion, because it's not about relating to me as a person. It is about I need to be suspicious of you because you are the one who's going to take my life away. As opposed to, I'm the one who's supposed to get to know you, know who you are, know what your community is, but also have enough to say when bad cops do bad things, that good cops say, no, you can no longer be here. And what we find is that a lot of police unions want to protect them. And I get that, like anybody who they want to protect their family member. But the price that you pay for that is that you lose community credibility. And there was a study that was done in Grand Rapids, and which said that most of the stops that happens in Grand Rapids, Hispanic and African Americans were twice as much likely to get pulled over than whites. That was done by the police department. And they decided that we have to start thinking differently about why we do what we do. Every police department has biases. And it's really a healthy thing to identify your biases, work on getting rid of those biases, and trying to work towards how do we begin to humanize the people whom we say we're supposed to protect and serve, as opposed to we see you as the enemy. And when things are reduced to law and order, it becomes a touch point to say, we don't see you as human.
Picking up on that, we want to believe that a criminal conviction means that the accused was in fact guilty, that she or he did the crime and should do the time. The death penalty is a final verdict when there's no coming back from that, obviously. Some statistics that the film shared with us is that for every 9 people on death row, 1 is released. That hit pretty hard, because that means that we are currently realizing in real time 1 out of 9 was, oops, how many men and women lost their lives unjustly so? Countless people. Does did the movie for you, or just in general, and knowing the disproportionate levels of, as you shared earlier, Black men and women arrested, imprisoned, does it shape how you see the death penalty in America?
Oh, absolutely. Because if you remember in the movie when Bryant was interviewing the family, and I think it was the youngest daughter says, "My daddy isn't the only one in prison. The entire family is in prison. The entire family is on death row." And I think sometimes we miss that the death penalty isn't just about a person. It's about an entire family. And if you want to even expand that, it's about an entire race in which they are when young Black men begin to think about, that's a real possibility that I could be on death row. And I think about the words in which Walter used. He said, it's a bad thing when you're considered guilty the day that you were born. And that's the hard thing that a lot of Black men carry with them, that the day in which they were born, they were already considered guilty. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a traumatic thing in which a lot of us, including myself, that can change just walking out of this building, and my whole life can change because maybe I fit the description of a person who looks like me, who possibly robbed a bank, which actually happened to me.
It did.
Yeah. I was coming out of my church and I was on my way to the bank, and my secretary called me and said, "Don't go to the bank." I said, "Why?" She said, there was an African American who had just robbed the bank, and he wears a Chicago Bulls red hat. I had on a Chicago Bulls red hat. That could have been me. Easily. Even though it wasn't. But I fit the description. And so we all carry that trauma, saying that at any time, it can happen to me. And so a family carries that trauma with them. And I think about the power in which these have on Black families. And it is because once you become part of the criminal justice system, your ability to make money goes to zero. Because what? You have to look at every job application. You have to say, were you ever convicted of a felon? Have you ever been in jail? And I think one of the best things in which people can get involved in, and that is being sponsored by, in fact, it was voted on by the Michigan legislature with the help of James LeGrand, is that should be taken off. That you should not be given a sentence, a lifelong sentence, because of a mistake that never leaves you. Mm-hmm. And it increases the wealth gap. Mm-hmm. Because if you are a felon, you can't get food stamps. If you're a felon, you can't get any help. And it just exacerbates the path of incarceration. Mm-hmm. That is like a stigmata that you can never get rid of. Mm-hmm. And now jail is kind of the credentialing mechanism for young Black men.
Yeah, you think about some of that we mentioned earlier with being able to arrest somebody and lock them up if they're without a job after they've been recently emancipated slaves. And then the machine that starts in the late 1800s that just continues on into cycles like that today, where the machine, the system is designed to keep some people down.
And I just think that the death penalty it becomes more about whom we can kill as opposed to whom we can show compassion.
Hmm. Hmm. I think especially as Christians, we look at is it about getting even? And is it our responsibility or right to even hold that? Kind of wanted to bring it to the systems and some of the structures that are in place. There's a character in the movie, Anthony Hinton, who spent 30 years in prison, 28 of those years on death row. The movie takes place something like 40 years ago. He was just released ahead of the movie's release. And the sheriff in particular of the town was who distorted justice in order to keep him in prison. The sheriff was reelected 6 times, was up until office until like last year, I want to say. Do you sense now that there's a tide that's turning?
I think it's too early to say. I think the things that are going on now is really that it became part of George Floyd's death, touched off something in which Black people have been saying for years, but now white people are finally saying, oh, that's what's going on here. And I think because of a lot of young whites who want to get behind something in which there can be systemic change, I think it's now starting to take on some energy and some traction. But I still think it's too early to say if that's holding, because just like places like in Alabama where the sheriff got elected 6 times. Mm-hmm. And well, how did he get elected 6 times? It could be because there's gerrymandering in Alabama, in which he gets his people to vote, mm-hmm. not so much one vote for one person. And in the South is really been kind of those places where that kind of gerrymander has happened. But I think we are on a journey that I think is taking us further along than I can say that we've in 20 years. Whether that will sustain, that depends if the moment turns into a movement.
The moment turns into a movement that is sustained for a while, right? I think that's some of the conversation behind this series is it was be more convenient, I think, to talk one time rather than say, we're going to have a series to prolong it as long into the summer and onward rather than just a one-off. You mentioned, turning a moment into a movement. What's one thing that we can do now as a church, as Encounter Church in specifically? One thing that we can do next?
I think the one thing that you can do is to have a conversation about mass incarceration. And I'd be interested to hear of what family members have had run-ins with the law. I'm sure that there's quite a few who've had those kinds of incidents. And to contrast that with, now how do we become more approximate to those kinds of individuals? I think if we begin there, then I think it provides a space in which, do we talk about rehabilitation? Do we talk about what it means for that person to be back engrafted into the community? Or do we fall back on, it's all about punitive, things in which we do? And we have to ask that question. So the Good Samaritan story is a great story to kind of have as a lens to say, what does it mean for us Because at the end of that story, you notice that Jesus doesn't answer the question for him. And we don't know exactly what happened to this young man. I always wonder, what was the next decision he made after Jesus told him, go and do likewise? I want to see the movie in which we find out what he did.
Yeah, so you're turning it on us, right? Where Jesus says, go and do likewise. Your move, church, right? I want to thank you for being here again and for making the time in your schedule. I know in your position and with your conversations, you've been asked a lot to jump in, and just so deeply grateful for your contributions as always. Thank you, and thank you more broadly for your work in general as well, and championing the conversations and challenging, encouraging us to take that next step, go and do likewise. I want to speak as well to those of you watching online. July 22 at 5 o'clock, same place, YouTube Live and Facebook Live. We're going to have a conversation with Crystal J. Sanders. She is, as a reminder, she has an MA in education and an MFA, is currently finishing her PhD in education at U of M, a published poet, teacher, activist, and public speaker. And we're going to talk to her about how some of these racial discrepancies are prevalent throughout history in education and what they mean today. I know from when we were talking earlier, you mentioned this, recognition, this realization that there's this almost pipeline from education on to prison. So I'm excited for us as a community to dig into that. And I know it's going to be a huge learning opportunity for me, as all of these conversations have been, and I think for all of us as well. So again, I just want to say thank you. Let's drop him some thank you, and drop Pastor Reggie some love in the comments section below as well. Thank you so much.